Okay, so we're going to talk about natural selection and some of the evidence for evolutionary change today. There we go. And let's just dive in here with a quick refresher from what we talked about last time. So if you paid attention to what I had to say last time, this is going to be tacked right onto that. Okay, so let's kind of pick up where we left off. We left off after we kind of explained sort of where Darwin got his ideas, like how he came up with what he came up with, right? Um, and I left you with this, Darwin's famous work on the origin of species by means of natural selection, his famous drawing in his notebook where he scrawled the words, "I think." It's tremendously powerful, and it changed forever all of biology, as well as many of the other sciences, because it's all intertwined together. But remember, his big idea, like the whole of it, really, you could kind of summarize it, was he was describing a way that nature could do exactly what humans can do. Like when humans made corn, when humans made cabbage, when humans made dogs. Like humans did all this stuff just by selectively breeding. So he's like, hey, couldn't nature do something just as profound? And that was that's the whole fundamental basis of all of his idea of evolution. It's just a natural selecting process. So today we're going to dive in and we're going to talk about how nature selects. How does nature do this? Okay, so let's dive in here. And just as a quick kind of reminder here, we've talked about Darwin's theory quite a bit, sort of how he got to where he got, but it's been like over 150 years since he came up with these ideas. And I want you to understand, because the internet is replete with misinformation, like every single scientific test that has ever been done, on Darwin's theory has showed us that his ideas are correct. Okay? Um, like this is probably one of the most well-tested ideas in all of science. More than likely better tested than even any of Einstein's ideas. Okay? For instance, oftentimes hear people saying, well, can evolution make predictions? Is it anything that we can see? And the answer is without a doubt, a resounding yes. And I put a picture up here of the Samoan butterfly, and I'm trying to remember exactly how the story goes. But so what happened was in Samoa, people who study butterflies, who like to watch butterflies, noticed that the butterfly population was declining drastically with this particular species of butterfly. Okay, scientists went in and studied the situation and noticed that there was a certain bacteria that was killing all the males before they were hatched, but females weren't affected. Okay, in the end, what happened is that nearly all the butterflies died. Nearly every single butterfly died of this species. Like they were on the verge of extinction, right? Scientists were closely monitoring the situation. They wanted to know what was going on, like how this bacteria was killing the butterflies. They had also sequenced the DNA. Remember, we just got done talking about this. They had sequenced the DNA from this butterfly and were closely looking at it. And then what occurred was the butterflies started coming back, which is really weird. And they're like, that's strange. So they looked for the bacteria. The bacteria was still there, but what they found was something new in the genome of the butterfly. They found that there was a mutation someplace in the DNA that conferred some resistance. Okay, within only 1 year, that's 10 generations of butterflies. Like they grow up, they have babies, they grow up, they have babies. 10 times, 1 year, every single male in the population had that exact same mutation. Now, did they all develop them individually? No, they did not. They did not all develop that mutation individually. What happened was that the only ones that survived happened to be the ones that had that mutation and passed it on. And so over the course of, we're not talking millions of years here. We're talking 1 year. Over the course of 1 year, this butterfly population evolved. It changed. Did it look any different? Heck no, it looked the same. It looked exactly the same. But as you're going to find out as we talk a little bit further, evolutionary change is not just about physical characteristics. I know that's what you think. You're thinking about like elephants sprouting wings and like, like dinosaurs flying and things like that. But yeah, those are like big grandiose external changes, but much of evolutionary change is kind of hidden from us. You don't see it unless you look at the chemical differences. Okay, so these butterflies experienced a real evolutionary change, and it had to do with the mutation that probably one butterfly experienced and passed it on to all future generations. So it can happen very, very rapidly, right? We'll get into a little bit more of this as we go along because I want you to kind of see sort of how that plays out. So let's talk about what goes on with nature, okay? First off, Darwin said that there was a struggle for existence. You remember the maple trees in the last lecture that I talked about? Okay, the struggle is real, right? Anybody have a cat like that? Yeah, my cat has. I had to actually put in a dog door for my cat. Like he would eat me if I just like didn't let him go outside. He would like take me down to the ground and like bite me. So put in a dog door for our cat. I literally took a Sawzall and cut a hole in the side of my wall and put a giant dog door in so that my cat could get in and out. Because he's huge, like just a gigantic cat. But anyway, all joking aside, there is competition. Remember back to ecology, we talked about limiting factors, things that limit the growth of populations, right? Bunny rabbits don't just get to have babies forever and ever and ever. They can have as many as they can have, but nature's going to limit them. There's going to be things that limit how big the population can get, right? And those are called limiting factors. It limits their ability to just like take over the entire planet, right? So organisms have to compete with not only other different organisms, but others among the same species. Every single squirrel outside is competing for the same nuts. They're competing for the same mates. They're competing for the same food sources, shelter, all those things, right? And the ones that can do it better are the ones who survive and pass their genes on, right? So the first step is to recognize that existence is a struggle, okay? The second thing you have to kind of come to grips with is that variation exists and it's totally natural. None of this, none of evolutionary change, none of Darwin's natural selection works without A, there being a struggle to survive, and B, there being variation already present. Take a look at these shells over here. Anybody's probably found these. If you've been down at the ocean, you've probably found these little periwinkle shells. They're really fun to pick up. They're all sorts of different little colors. They're all the same species. They're all the same organism. They can all mate with each other, but there's tremendous variation in their shells. Okay, that variation has to already be there. If nature's going to select for something specific, okay, for instance, darker shells over lighter shells, there's not time for that to just suddenly evolve to come about, right? It's got to already be there. So the thing that we're looking for has got to already be there. So if nature's going to select for something, you've got to have some darker shells and some lighter shells. The variation is important. Look around the room, right? Variation is the spice of life. None of you look the same. Even if you have a brother or sister, you look quite different, don't you? So there's lots of variation already present in the human population. The same thing holds for nature. I know you look at the squirrels and you think they all look the same. They look at you and think you all look the same. I'm just guessing there. But there is tremendous variation. In fact, in a population of rabbits, there's more variation in a population of rabbits than there are in the entire population of humans on the planet. That's how much genetic difference there is in rabbits. It's just you don't see it so much on the outside. Most of it's internal. Okay? So let's read what I wrote here. I said there's a natural amount of variation in a population. This leaves certain organisms better able to survive in the current environment. So check this. Environments don't stay the same on our planet. They change. Even if humans didn't have anything to do with it, guess what? Stuff like plate tectonics, stuff like ice ages, right? Like the environments change. What was a field becomes a lake. What was a lake becomes a field. Mountains form, mountains erode. Over the course of geological time, and sometimes much shorter, Environments change, so whatever is best currently is undoubtedly not going to be best in the future. Things will change, okay? So when he said the fittest, this is a word I want to kind of really hammer home to you, and I put it in quotes here. You've heard the phrase before, survival of the fittest. That does not mean the one that's got the biggest muscles. It does not mean the one that's fastest. Okay? It doesn't mean the one that's the cutest. What it means is that whatever organism of that species fits the environment the best, that's the one that survives. Do you follow? It's different than which one's the strongest, right? It's which one fits the environment. So don't twist that phrase. Fitness is not necessarily strength. It can be, but it's not necessarily, okay? This depends on the environment. And environments change, so too will the organisms that inhabit them. So we've seen this across the surface of our planet. When we look back into the fossil record, we look at things like horses. They used to be tiny, wee little things that looked like dogs. Their environment changed. It changed drastically to being the savannas and the grasslands where horses live today. Horses, their entire hoof changed. Their toes changed. Now they've got one big toe. They used to have three. Now they're much, much bigger. They're huge, gigantic creatures versus the tiny little toy-looking things that they looked like in ancient geological past. Okay, so we've seen that happen as the environments actually change. So the next one I want to kind of hit on is called adaptation. And there are many different types of adaptation. I want to point out two in particular that you're going to see on the test. Okay? All an adaptation is a heritable characteristic that increases an organism's ability to both survive and reproduce. So check this out, because I'm going to come back to it. You're not the most fit if all you do is survive. You've also got to reproduce. Do you see it? Just because an organism like an individual bunny rabbit survives into old age doesn't make it fit. It has to both survive and survive long enough to make babies, because that's where it passes its genetics down, right? And that's what makes it fit in terms of natural selection. Okay, and that, of course, is a leaf insect from like South America. It looks just like a leaf, doesn't it? Does anybody know what we call it when something looks really similar to something in the environment? Camouflage, absolutely. And that thing is exhibiting great camouflage. But there's another thing that I want to also point out here, and it's called mimicry. I'll put up a slide here in a second on camouflage. Mimicry is an awful lot like camouflage. And if you've ever studied butterflies, any butterfly-ophiles in here? Nobody loves butterflies. When I was a kid, I loved butterflies, along with everything else in nature, snakes. It didn't matter. Like, if it was in nature, I was collecting it, and I was going to look at it and bring it home and show my mom, and she would freak out. Put it in my pants pocket, it'd go through the wash, you know, that sort of thing. Can't tell you how many poor worms went through the washing machine at my house. Lots. I damaged that thing beyond repair, I'm sure. So one thing that I used to love collecting and love finding out in nature was butterflies. They're beautiful. Here's two butterflies, the viceroy and the monarch, that look almost identical. Like, almost identical. Like, unless you are good at telling things apart, you can't tell them apart. Look at the little white splotches on the viceroy. That's really one of the differences that you can see there. If you also kind of look at the plate patterns on the butterfly itself, okay, they're a little bit different. See how there's this kind of ring down here on the tail of the viceroy versus up here it doesn't have that on the monarch. But it's got to spread its wings to even see that, right? Why do they look so similar? What's happened here is the viceroy is mimicking the monarch. Now, the why question is really easy to answer. The why is simple, because the monarch is toxic. And it is brightly colored like that to let birds know that if they eat it, they're going to yak. They don't want to eat it. It's gross. Okay? The viceroy is quite tasty, and birds would eat it. But they're not going to touch it because they know what a monarch tastes like. And it looks just like a monarch. Do you get it? Now, how? The how question is a little more difficult. Think about this. The viceroy's not sitting around one day going, Gee, it'd be awful nice if I could look like that monarch, you know. I'd stop getting eaten, you know. I could have more babies. Things would be pretty sweet, you know. It didn't happen like that. It doesn't work that way. Okay? You might also ask yourself another nagging question. If the viceroy can pull this off and look like the monarch, why doesn't every butterfly look like the monarch? So the birds will just leave him alone. It makes sense, right? Or why doesn't every butterfly just become toxic? Why not? Well, the answer is actually, it's kind of simple. It boils down to genetics. Remember how I said that evolution has to act on factors that are already there, variations that already exist in the population. Okay, so check this out. There's a population of butterflies that the viceroy is related to. And somewhere down that line in ancient times, there were some color patternings, in other words, some proteins that is DNA coded for, that were somewhat similar to a monarch's color patternings. Probably not enough so that it was left alone, but enough so that less of them got eaten if they had a little bit more of that color. And over time, natural selection quite literally sculpted it because it selected for the genes that allowed it to look more and more like the monarch. Okay? So if you think about other butterflies, they probably don't have a gene for that color. Right? They don't have a gene for a wing shape that looks anything like that. So they're not going to be able to pull that trick off. Natural selection is not going to select for those things. Right? In terms of the toxicity, the monarch's toxic because of what it eats. And there's very specific requirements for a digestive tract and how it can survive and eat a toxic plant like milkweed. Right? Other butterflies aren't going to be able to pull that trick off. So that's why the viceroy is not just going ahead and making itself toxic. Do you see? So I want you to really grasp the concept that variation has to already be there. Okay? Natural selection doesn't suddenly make it. There's not suddenly a need and it suddenly creates this thing. It's already there. It just amplifies it. Okay? So keep that in mind as we go along here. Here's the other one that you guys already mentioned. Do you see the moth? Can you see it? Its head is to the left, and its wings are folded in towards the right near the top of the screen. There's the moth. You can't see its legs. So camouflage, like we saw in the leaf insect on the previous page, that's when a species blends to its natural environment. It blends. See, it's different than mimicry. Mimicry is looking like another organism. Camouflage is blending into the environment. You see the difference? Okay. So this as well, just like mimicry, every moth doesn't blend perfectly with the environment. Most of them do pretty well for the most part, but blending this closely, you've got to have some genetics that are already kind of somewhat lend themselves to this. In the natural selection, we'll select for the ones that fit in the best. Now, what happens when this environment suddenly changes from a forest floor with a bunch of leaves to a desert? Do you think this moth is going to do very well? No, right? It's a totally different color background, among other things. What's going to happen is if it changes slowly enough, if the environment changes slowly enough, and there's time for adaptation to take place, if this moth already has some color patterning that might help it in that environment, in other words, some of them have a little lighter color, a little darker color, it could manage to survive and change and evolve as the environment changes, right? But we already know environments do change, right? Deserts form, deserts go away. Oceans form, oceans go away. Now, another key takeaway that we've already mentioned is selection and reproduction, okay? It's not enough just to survive. It's not enough for nature just to select against the ones that aren't the most fitting into the environment. The ones that survive have got to reproduce. It's all about making the babies. Okay? So reproductive success is really kind of what makes it the most fit for the environment. Not that it lives into old age or it lives long at all. It just has to live long enough to reproduce. Right? Mosquitoes don't live very long, but they make lots and lots of babies. They're quite fit for their environment. Now, anybody ever seen a spider like that? It is a wolf spider. And they get huge. They're some of our largest spiders. They're like almost as big as the palm of my hand, like some of them are. They're huge. So I was thinking about this natural selection and reproduction one day when I happened to find one of these guys in the grass, and I had a group of students with me. And this is actually a female, and if you look close, she is carrying all of her babies on her abdomen. Do you see them all? Look at all those little baby spiders. They are so cool when you find them like this. And most wolf spiders are pretty docile, so usually I can pick them up and play with them and stuff. So I found this big, huge wolf spider, and I pick her up, and I'm holding her, and I like tap her, and the weirdest thing happens. All the babies leap off her back. Like immediately. It was like the most bizarre thing. Her abdomen like shrunk 2 times. Like all the babies just ejected themselves and like buried themselves in the grass. It was so creepy. And then I left her alone for a second, and she kind of chills out, and she sticks out a back leg like that. And all of a sudden, all the little babies come rushing out of the grass from I can't even see where, like up her leg and right back on her abdomen. It was the coolest thing, right? But then she takes off because she's scared I'm going to touch her again, right? And I'm thinking to myself, there's like 100 babies on there. What about the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 that just couldn't get back on, weren't either too afraid to get on or just weren't fast enough to get on? They're not going to survive, right? They're gone. They're no longer in the gene pool. They no longer get to pass down their genetics. So the ones that survive situations like this, in the case of that, happen to be the ones that were a little less fearless, a little more fearless. Happen to be the ones that were a little faster. Right? So the environment, the situation dictates what's really the best fit, right? So let's kind of hammer down on natural selection here. And at the end, I'm going to give you kind of a breakdown of all the statements that we've made. Okay. So the net result of all of this is that the organisms, the species that best fit an environment are the ones that are able to get the resources, to get the food, right? To get the water, to get the habitat, okay? So over time, there's this tendency for organisms to adapt to their environment. This is natural selection. This is nature selecting, the environment dictating which organisms get to reproduce. Do you see it? Do you see how this is different, very slightly, than artificial selection? Than me going, I want a really weird looking dog. So I'm specifically going to take this dog that looks ugly and this dog over here that looks ugly, and I'm going to breed them together. I'm not letting them breed with any other dogs. I'm going to select that they get to breed together, and I'm going to take these really ugly puppies, and I'm going to sell these puppies and breed them. And I'm going to call them, I don't know, Weimarammers or whatever you might want to call them. I don't know. Who knows, right? So that's artificial selection. This is nature doing the same thing. Only nature doesn't pick things that it kind of likes. Nature selects things that are able to survive the environment that's presented to them. Okay? And so you can see this in Darwin's, in some of these famous birds over here. Look at the beaks right here, right? Look at how adapted they are, right? This one that feeds on nectar, right? Look at the hook on its beak, okay? This one that probably ate insects and nectar, right? So they have slightly different, a crushing beak for crushing seeds. Even though they're all closely related as birds, they've got very different beaks because their environments dictated it. So change happened, right? Let's throw it up here. Here are all 4 of the statements that I've been hammering home to you. If you're taking notes, this might be the one you write down because this is everything that we've talked about. First one, organisms make more babies than can possibly survive. We know this for a fact. Out in nature, it's a harsh, cruel place. Not every baby survives. Variations, number 2, are natural and happen in the population. Just look around yourselves. Variation is the spice of life. It is totally natural. No matter what you do, if sexual reproduction is happening, right, meiosis is happening, recombination is happening, you have tremendous variation. Okay? And that allows individuals with useful variations to survive long enough to mate and pass those genes on. So what happens is over time, a population can change to look entirely different from the original, and we can look at it and go, oh my gosh, Like, that no longer looks like the original thing, or that looks different enough now that we're going to call it something new. But you can see how this might be a very slow, gradual process on the order of geological time, right? But it can also be really rapid. And we have seen this in modern times. If we're watching closely enough, we can see rapid evolutionary change. It just depends on the situation and the organism, okay? So over time, a population, notice your underlined population. I did not say individual. Individuals like you and I do not evolve. Think back to those butterflies, the Samoan butterflies I was talking about. Okay, think back to those things. One butterfly did not evolve. What happened is that in that population already, there was a mutation somewhere. Some butterfly happened to be born with the mutation, and that mutation happened to give it some resistance against that bacteria. And it might have been not a thing at all for a long, long time, right? Like hundreds, thousands of years, who knows? And then suddenly it gets infected by this thing, this bacteria, and now it's able to survive. And over the course of just a few generations, every butterfly looks like that original one that had that weird freak mutation, which really wasn't a big thing at all to begin with. So there's lots of differences in our DNA that could be useful later on, or maybe not useful. But what determines that? The environment, right? Now, humans are quite different because we mold and sculpt our environment. So we'll talk about humans a little separately later on. It's easier to just talk about nature right now because in many ways we've removed ourselves as much as we can anyway. I want to give you a couple examples though, and I think these are really powerful examples of how this plays out in human populations. Because if you're thinking to yourself the human population does not evolve over time, that natural selection does not play any role in who we are and what we look like and what our populations are, you could not be more incorrect. Like, it has magnificently sculpted us. Let's take a look here. Here's the first one I want to show you. And I want you to kind of drink this in. The first point is that adaptations are not perfect. They sure as heck look perfect. When you look at that leaf insect, it looks like a leaf, like almost perfectly like a leaf. It's not perfect. I know it looks that way, but in reality, any adaptation is just good enough. I know it kind of stinks to say it that way, but it's true. Adaptations are good enough just so that they can allow the organism to pass down its genes better than others of its own kind. That's really what it boils down to. Also, banish from your mind that natural selection is working towards some finished product. Nature is not trying to sculpt the perfect leaf insect. It's not trying to sculpt the perfect viceroy, the perfect monarch. It just appears to us that way. Here's an example I want to give you, and it's called sickle cell anemia. You might know somebody who has this disease. Okay? In sickle cell anemia, your normal blood cells can sometimes sickle, particularly when you start exercising, running low on oxygen. For somebody with sickle cell anemia, their blood changes shape. And when it looks like this pointy, kind of elongated sickle shape, it doesn't carry oxygen. So in your mind right now, I want you to think, is it good to have sickle cell anemia? No, right? Because your blood changes shape and it doesn't carry oxygen. And we all know blood better carry oxygen or we die. Okay, so sickle cell anemia is a real bad disease, right? You wouldn't want it. Except that if we look at sickle cell disease, there's some really weird things that are going on when we study it. And the first is that in North America, where we are right now, sickle cell anemia is very uncommon. And just as you had thought, it's a total disadvantage. It's not a good thing because it makes it unable for your blood to carry oxygen. You start working out, you start running away from a bear or something, and suddenly you can't breathe. You got no oxygen. Bad, right? But in other parts of the world, where a disease called malaria is common, sickle cell disease is also very, very common, much more so than it is here. So looking at this situation, scientists were able to tease out what was actually going on. But before I move forward, I want to show you the difference. What causes sickle cell disease? Because you're ready for this now. You understand genetics. Check this out. Here's a DNA sequence, okay? If I were to transcribe this and then translate this DNA, I would find out that in one codon, there is a single point mutation. Remember that one? We've got a T and an A here. It's going to flip-flop. A T is going to become an A, and an A is going to become a T. One mutation is all it takes to cause sickle cell. And glutamic acid, which would be the normal gene, normal part of the protein, flips to become valine. Why valine? Because now it reads GTG instead of GAG. That's it, right? Very simple change. Simple mutation, okay? Now, that's what causes, if you have valine there, this is what causes sickle cell versus normal blood cell. One little mutation, okay? Now, when we look at places like Africa, this is where this was discovered, by the way, and we're going to watch a video over this in a little bit. The correlation between people who have malaria, places where malaria is common, and sickle cell is striking. It is shocking. So when scientists notice patterns like this, they start to dig deeper. Okay? If you don't know what malaria is, it's a disease carried by mosquitoes that makes you very, very sick and can kill you. I have had friends that have had malaria, and let me tell you what, they look like death warmed over. They're having the sweats, they're looking pale and pasty, they've got fever. Like, it's a horrible, horrible disease, and it's carried by mosquitoes, okay? So, when we take a look here, what we realized was that sickle cell disease, if you have sickle cell disease and you get bit by one of these infected mosquitoes that gives you malaria, as the malaria infects your cells, what happens is they go from the nice round shape to a sickle, and it kills the malaria. Crazy, right? So here's a scenario where having another disease protects you from a worse disease, because malaria will definitely kill you. But sickle cell disease is not very much of an advantage, but if you have sickle cell disease, the malaria doesn't affect you because your cells kill it because they turn sickle when they get infected with malaria. How crazy is that, right? Yeah. Has multiple sclerosis? Sure. So that is one way. I mean, it's more complex than that, but that's an interesting way to simplify it. And that is also, like, you've got to look at variations, like even sometimes diseases like this and like that, where sometimes they confer a certain advantage, or you can see like where that would have come from, right? So since we're at the point now where we understand Punnett squares, let's make a Punnett square. Check this out. So if you have big S, okay, or little s, you are not at an advantage in places that have malaria. So in my key down here, the S here that's not filled in, that's not red with the little top hat, okay, is the normal gene, okay. The bright S there, the lowercase one, is the defective gene. So if you have little s, okay, then you have sickle cell, okay. If you have the red S, you have sickle cell. If you have regular S, big S, you do not have sickle cell. But you can be heterozygous. You could be big S, couldn't you? So check this out. If you have full-blown, if you're homozygous recessive for sickle cell, that's real bad. You're probably not going to survive, okay? It's real bad. But if you are homozygous dominant for not sickle cell, big S, that's not filled in red, then you're also going to die if you live someplace that has malaria, okay? But if you happen to be big S, a heterozygote, okay, you've got both the advantage of one gene that protects you from malaria, but the disadvantage of that same gene that hurt you with sickle cell. But you've still got one good copy, one big S, that's capable of keeping you from having full-blown sickle cell anemia. So evolution is going to push this towards people in places like this area in Africa as being heterozygous. But you can't be heterozygous without some people being homozygous. So there's always going to be some disadvantaged folks. So check out my Punnett square here. Both mom and dad in my Punnett square are heterozygotes, which means they have some protection from malaria, but they also have a mild case of sickle cell, okay? Their babies, one of them is probably going to die because they're big S, big S. They have no protection against, they're normal. They have no protection against malaria. If they're here in the US, they'd be fine, but not someplace where there's malaria. Okay? Another baby that's little s, is going to have full-blown sickle cell. They're probably going to die too. But two of their children are going to be heterozygous, big S, which means they're protected from malaria and they don't have full-blown sickle cell. Did evolution sculpt the perfect creature? No. All it did was allow for the thing that could survive longest to reproduction to be the most fit. So the most fit for this environment is big S, right? In America, that's not the most fit. The most fit would be big S, Do you see the difference in how that can play out? But it didn't sculpt this super being. It just worked as to what was best fit for the particular environment. It's weird, isn't it? I want to mention another one here. Actually, I want to mention this first. So natural selection, like, I know we like to think of nature as this lovey-dovey kind of friendly thing out in the world. And nature is wonderful, and I love being out in nature. But natural selection, at its root, it's a brutal process. It's ugly, right? Most, if not many, of the adaptations don't succeed. They don't survive, right? Like things have to die for this to function. And then remember, if an environment changes faster than the species can adapt, if there's not enough time, like in the case of the rock that struck us that wiped out the dinosaurs, we call that extinction. This whole species can be wiped out if it cannot adapt fast enough to the changing environment. As we know, environments change. Sometimes environments change too rapidly. I want to give you one last example because it's an interesting one. And I bet you know some folks who have Alzheimer's disease. Anybody know anybody who has Alzheimer's? Yeah, it's a pretty common. When does Alzheimer's happen to you? When you're young or when you're old? Old. Everybody knows that, right? So why wouldn't natural selection weed out Alzheimer's disease? It's a horrible disease, right? It's a terrible disease. Why doesn't it weed it out? Why doesn't natural selection operate to make us better creatures? Yeah. Aha. Do you see it? If it doesn't affect you while you're young, natural selection's got nothing to say about it. Check it out. If somebody survived long enough to have Alzheimer's, chances are, if they were going to reproduce, they already did. Natural selection selects based on reproduction. So if it's not going to affect whether or not they can reproduce. Now, let's reverse this around. What if Alzheimer's affected young people? Natural selection would weed that crap out right quick. You better believe it. Like nobody would have it. Why? Because if you woke up in the morning and couldn't remember who your mate was, or what they looked like, or whether you liked them or not, like, do you think that you would have a mate? Probably not, right? So those genes wouldn't get passed down. But because it only affects people after their childbearing years, it's really not favorable or unfavorable as far as natural selection and evolution is concerned. So the part of the takeaway here is don't think that everything about the human species, everything about the squirrel species has to do with evolutionary change, because it doesn't. There are things that are not directly involved because of evolution. It's not going to have anything to do with whether or not somebody has Alzheimer's, right? Now, I know there's other characteristics and a whole lot more to that than what I just gave you, but you know, it's not going to sculpt on that because it happens after childbearing years. So there's a lot of finer points here. Anyway, does anybody have questions about the quiz that we were just doing? I think we answered everything. Good. Cool. You can close that out.